so we have a speaker this evening. Rodger McDaniel's here, and he's going to actually talk to us. I wanted to say a little bit about him before you hear him. It's like, I thought about those things. He's been a legislator for about 10 years, right, in the legislature here in Wyoming. Then he attended law school at some point, kind of in there. Started practicing law, worked as a lawyer for about 20 years. Served during part of that time as the director of the Department of Family Services for the state of Wyoming. Goes to divinity school at the Isle of School in Denver. Gets a Master of Divinity degree. Ends up then serving as minister at the Highland Church in Cheyenne for also about 15 years. Retiring just recently, a month ago. 1 month ago. I don't know if we'll hear anything about that. But that's quite a remarkable list of things. And then in the last 10 years or so, started publishing books. And those books, I have actually read every one of them. Every one of them. Even, what's the one, the Fist Fight in Heaven with
Howard Zinn.
Howard Zinn, yes, Howard Zinn and Lois Moton and Fist Fight. It's like, you know, the Sherman Alexie story about the Lone Ranger at Tonto. But I love the idea that Howard Zinn somehow ended up in a Wyoming story. But I thought about all those books together. You're going to talk primarily about the Profiles in Courage book this evening, or maybe you don't want to give it away. Okay, no giving it away. But the most recent book, Profiles in Courage, has chapters a lot that have something to do with Powder River. They're interesting profiles on Tom Bell, on Lynn Dickey. Lynn Dickey was one of the first people I came to know well when I lived here, and through Dinus too, yes. But I thought, looking at all these things, including the books, which deal a lot with issues around equity, social justice, fairness, what it means to have courage in a social setting that may be difficult for us, and how you stand for things, and when indeed maybe you don't stand for something too hard. You know what I mean? Sometimes we tend to maybe be intransigent when we could give a little to others. But there are these stories of people who knew when they had to be courageous for something. Are quite beautiful. And all of the work, the books and everything you've done, it strikes me, they all end up being in the category of service. They're all service professions and service activities in our society. So we're very grateful to have Rodger McDaniel here this evening, and thank you for being with us, and I will turn it over to you.
Thank you for that. In seminary, they taught us that after such an inspirational thing as we just witnessed, that the best thing the preacher can do is just say amen and sit down. But I never did that. So it's a joy for me to be with you all here tonight. Watching this little struggle with the technology reminded me that yeah, I've written 5 books with 2 fingers. My grasp on technology is less than complete. I've titled this book, or this talk tonight, Lynn Dickey and Tom Bell, Fist Fight for the Equality State. And it is, as was mentioned, a takeoff from the Sherman Alexie book, The Lone Ranger and Tonto, Fist Fight in Heaven. And most of you appear to me to be too young to remember The Lone Ranger and Tonto.
No way! No way!
But it was a 1950s television show that we kids never missed. The Lone Ranger teams up with Tonto to fight evil in the Wild West. And as kids, we knew that at the moment the Lone Ranger and Tonto showed up, there was hope. Kind of like when Tom Bell showed up in the 60s and Lynn Dickey in the 70s. They were as different from one another as the Lone Ranger and Tonto.
Thank you.
I'm sure many of you knew Tom Bell. Tom was sort of an in-your-face, confrontational sort of guy, and what I enjoyed most about writing his story was his relationship with Stan Hathaway. When Stan Hathaway became governor, there were few, if any, environmental voices. There were no environmental protection laws to speak of. Politicians were simply not accustomed to having people correct them and challenge them publicly. And suddenly there's Tom Bell challenging the governor of the state who proposed diverting the Green River water to this part of the state for industrial development, and put this proposal together basically behind closed doors, and then when it was ready brought it out, and was shocked when Tom Bell and his High Country News took him on and criticized him and some of the legislators who were involved in that. And that started a very difficult relationship between the two of them, which ended when Hathaway left office. And on his way out of office, his last day as governor, a newspaper man stopped him and said, Governor, now that you're not going to be governor anymore, what's the first thing you're going to do? And Stan said, I'm going to get in my car, and I'm going to drive to Lander, and I'm going to hit Tom Bell in the mouth. Now, Lynn Dickey was altogether different. So far as I know, there has never been a sighting of Lynn Dickey without that characteristic smile on her face. She was a bridge builder. She could bring environmentalists and the ag community to the same table long enough that they understood their common interests. Each, Tom and Lynn, had a physical disability. Tom lost an eye in World War II, and Lynn, of course, the use of her legs in a car accident, but neither of their lives or their intellect or their energy was ever diminished by those limitations. And they understood the meaning of hope. I spent 15 years in the hope business, and as a pastor in these last few years, I was often asked, where do you find hope? And in these times, sometimes that's difficult. But I pastored a courageously hopeful church in Cheyenne, and I wanted to come here tonight and talk to you about those two traits, courage and hope. Being invited to speak here is such a great honor, such as the respect I've had for many years for the Powder River Basin Resource Council. It goes back to my days in the legislature. I was in the legislature when I was 22 years old, and I get a kick today about they talk about these legislators who are young. You know, I was young in the legislature when being young meant something. Now, you know, they're in their mid-30s and they say, well, we have some young members of the legislature. But I remember those days working in the early days of the Wyoming Outdoor Council and the Powder River Basin Resource Council and the kinds of things that we worked together on to enact really significant environmental legislation for this state. But courage and hope are not the same. Everyone hopes for a positive outcome in the future. Hopeful people wish that justice would happen. Courageous people actually do what is necessary to make it happen. The little church I pastored is an example. We prayed for those who suffered the indignities of our unjust immigration system. We learned about a fellow named Juan who was an undocumented farmer in northeast Colorado. In the first year of Trump's administration, though Juan had lived in the United States for more than 2 decades, he had been brought here as an infant, he was among the thousands of people that the Trump administration ordered deported. We prayed for him. His wife, who was a U.S. citizen, his 4 children who were U.S. citizens, and his elderly parents who were citizens. We prayed that he would not be forced to leave them behind and be sent back to a country that he had not seen since his childhood. But we didn't stop at amen. Our church courageously gave Juan sanctuary in the church where immigration and custom enforcement officers were prohibited by law from entering to arrest him. Juan remained in sanctuary, safe from deportation, for 4 months before ICE hollered uncle, just a few days before Christmas that year, and Juan was allowed to return home, where he still farms the land and lives with his children, his wife, and his parents. That's how hope became courage. As when our little church, after acknowledging every Sunday morning that we worship God on land stolen from native peoples, we take a moment to contemplate what that means. The historical facts that we are worshiping on the ancestral lands of the Arapaho and the Cheyenne people is etched on the window of the church as you enter the building. Our hoped-for future included healed relationships between the heirs of the colonists and the heirs of the original owners of the land. Hope was never the end goal. And so today this church pays monthly cash reparations to the people of the Wind River Indian Reservation in exchange for our use of their land. That's how hope becomes courage. But the meaning of the word courage can be elusive. When I started to write the book, Profiles in Courage, I asked people around the state whom I knew in political circles or historians or others to tell me who they think stories should be told in a book called Profiles in Courage. And I quickly realized that not everybody defines the word courage the same way. The word doesn't mean the same thing to everyone. And so I decided that I needed to have a working definition of courage in order to identify the people whose stories would be told in the book. And I first went to my theological roots and the Hebrew prophets of the Old Testament, whom I spent a great deal of time studying while I was in seminary. Moses, Isaiah, Amos, Jeremiah, the rest. They found hope in their courage to demand justice by confronting the most cruel kings and pharaohs of ancient times. Then I came across a February 2000 article in a publication called Wyoming History News. It told of a group of Wyoming historians who had been tasked by Associated Press with identifying the 10 most significant news stories of the 20th century, which in 2000 comprised almost all of Wyoming history. And after their deliberations, which I would have loved to have been a part of, to hear those discussions, but after spending a good deal of time trying to persuade one another, they did agree on what they thought were the 10 most important stories of that century. The first one, they said, was the unequal treatment of women in the equality state. One of the historians said, there has been no commitment to women's rights throughout our whole history. Among the other 10 stories that they identified was the mistreatment of cultural, religious, and ethnic minorities. They cited Heart Mountain, the violence against Jehovah's Witnesses before and during World War II, the Black 14, Matthew Shepard's murder, and a third story that they identified to be among the 10 most significant was the mistreatment of indigenous peoples during our history. And so it occurred to me that the stories that would be included in a book called Profiles in Courage, Standing Against the Wyoming Wind, must be of those among the oppressed, their stories and the stories of their allies and people who stood with them. Here's an excerpt from the introduction to the book. In the iconic opening chapter of Centennial, James Michener offers readers a lesson on geology. He teaches that the Wyoming Wind was a big player in the formation of the land. Michener wrote, quote, "High winds whip over the prairies, exhausting the land and everything that grows upon it," end quote. Wyoming is also, I wrote in the introduction, known for its political winds. They too blow hard, whipping across the land, exhausting everything and everyone attempting to stand against them. They form the social, economic, academic, and political landscape, just as prehistoric winds form the mountains and the plains. As often as not, those who stand against the Wyoming wind are racial, religious, and other ethnic or cultural minorities or their allies and advocates. And so the book tells 13 stories of people and groups of people who have exhibited extraordinary courage during Wyoming history, in recognition of the fact that 3 of those top 10 stories of the 20th century were stories of people who sought to repair injustice by standing against the prevailing winds. But had I been a part of that group, there's another story I would have suggested should have been included. And that's the story of the rise of Wyoming's environmental movement in the 60s and 70s. Before the Powder River Basin Resource Council and the Wyoming Outdoor Council, and High Country News, there were few voices raised to stand against the wind, few speaking out against injustices visited upon the land, the air, the water, and the wild lands, rivers, and animals. But that group of historians explained why your story matters so much when they determined that another of the top 10 most significant stories of the century was what they called colonialism, which was identified as the control of Wyoming affairs by outside forces, such as mining companies, railroads, and other corporations. That was the Wyoming wind in which the Powder River Basin Resource Council was created to stand against. Tom Bell's papers at the American Heritage Center at the University of Wyoming, which, by the way, in your spare time, you have time to do that, you ought to go to the American Heritage Center and ask to see a box or two of Tom Bell's papers. There are a couple of hundred boxes. You know? Tom collected paper, and there are his speeches, his diaries, just notes that he made to himself, articles that he had written. It's a vast collection that paints a picture of the courage of this fellow. But his papers at the American Heritage Center includes notes of a telephone call he made in the 60s. Remember the environmental impact statement that on the Powder River Basin that was released that said that there were plans for a significant number of new mines, strip mines, and power plants to be built, and it talked about the way in which that would destroy the water that agriculture needs, the land that ag needs, and outdoors people enjoy. And in his papers is a note describing a phone call he made to Bill Barlow, who was a friend of his, who was living at Ground Zero in Campbell County. And Tom's note said, "I told him your way of life is threatened." And indeed, an environmental impact statement made it clear that our way of life in Wyoming would be extinguished unless somebody stood against that wind. And here we are this evening celebrating your 51st anniversary, made possible because seemingly disparate people found common cause for more than a half a century of courage, successes that should give us all hope during these trying times. I think the greatest source of hope we have in these difficult times is the common cause shared by everyone who suffers from injustice and those who advocate for them. If you think about the intersections of your work for environmental justice with all the other courageous work for justice, whether for the earth or victims of systemic racism or institutional poverty, or those whose sexual and gender identity is other than binary, there are intersections, common crossings and paths of political interests. The crusade for environmental justice did not arise in a vacuum, but in the wake of the civil rights movement and in the context of the fight for women's rights as a background. There are inherent and essential interconnections with race, gender, and class elements of environmental justice that make brothers and sisters of all who fight for justice in all of its forms. Leah Thomas has written a book called The Intersectional Environmentalists. And, she founded something called the Intersectional Environmentalists. She wrote a book called The Intersectional Environmentalists: How to Dismantle Systems of Oppression to Protect People and the Planet. She expresses her opinion that none of the groups, no group working for justice should exist in a silo. Quote, all who are concerned about issues ranging from climate change to social justice and education reform can unite to build better systems for our future. One of the icons of the Powder River Basin Resource Council is a role model, and that's Lynn Dickey, who was called the Joan of Arc on a steel stallion. Lynn earned her place in the history of this organization and the Wyoming environmental movement, but she was an intersectional environmentalist who understood how that work crosses lines into other justice work. Lynn advocated for ending the death penalty. She fought for the rights of disabled persons. She fought for nuclear disarmament, ending sanctions that were killing innocent people in Iraq, for women's rights and education reform, while working to improve conditions on the Wind River Indian Reservation. And in her spare time, she fought for environmental justice. But she recognized the common interests that all people who suffer from injustices experience. So whether it's the Powder River Basin Resource Council seeking justice for our way of life, or working people seeking fair wages, or women fighting to make their own healthcare decisions, parents fighting for the right to decide which books their children may read, the LGBTQ community demanding equality, or refugees and immigrants fighting an unjust immigration system. In the art world, they call it interstitial, which was a new word for me, for Leah Thomas's book, interstitial. And it refers to the basic nature of that which falls between familiar boundaries, making the work difficult to categorize within a single discipline. What it basically means is that there are spaces between the work you do and the work other social justice groups do. There are spaces that make the connection between all forms of injustice. And to silo ourselves in one without being an ally to those who suffer different forms of injustice weakens the entire movement. The greatest hope for us arises from recognizing those interstitial common spaces and acting together as though what is good for one is good for all. And so it is with the memory of Tom Bell and Lynn Dickey and their fight for justice. We join tonight in celebrating your 51 years of hope and courage, and say here's to the next half a century.